Join us on the greatest journey ever made. 30,000 years ago, a band of Ice Age hunters crossed a lost continent and populated a brand new world.
Chapter 1. The World Before the Crossing. Yana and the Edge of Everything.
Imagine standing at the edge of the known world. Not a cliff above the ocean, not the rim of a desert, but a vast, gently rolling plain of golden grass extending east to the horizon, broken by distant rivers glinting in Arctic light and the dark silhouettes of mountains far to the north. The year is something like 32,000 B.C. You are standing on the Yana River, in what would one day be called northeastern Siberia, at 71 degrees north latitude, deep within the Arctic Circle. The air is so cold it crystallizes in your lungs with every breath, each exhale a small white cloud that vanishes in the relentless wind. Yet you and your band are not freezing, not starving, not lost. You are dressed in layered furs sewn with ivory needles, garments crafted with a precision and intelligence that would not be matched again for thousands of years, stitched tight against the wind, layered for insulation, cut and shaped to allow movement without sacrificing warmth. Your spear is tipped with a carefully napped stone point, hafted with sinew and birch resin to a shaft of bone, and your belly is full from yesterday's mammoth hunt. You are exactly where you need to be. And yet, the world you inhabit is so alien to modern sensibility that it would take years simply to learn its rhythms, the way the rivers freeze by October and remain locked until May, the way the caribou herds move like a brown tide across the tundra in their seasonal migrations, the way the short Arctic summer explodes with life before vanishing into months of darkness. The sky overhead is an immensity of stars on clear nights, the aurora borealis rippling in curtains of green and violet light across the northern horizon. In the daylight hours, which in summer become nearly continuous, the landscape glows with a golden clarity that has no equivalent in warmer latitudes. To the east, across that vast and seemingly endless grassland, lies a continent no human being has ever touched. You do not know this. You are not an explorer in any sense we would recognize. You are a hunter, a survivor, a member of a small band of perhaps 25 or 30 people moving with the herds, following the rhythms of a world of ice and grass that your ancestors have navigated for as long as cultural memory reaches. You know which plants are edible and which are poisonous, which rivers flood dangerously in spring, where the best flint outcrops lie in the hills to the west, how to read a mammoth's body language in the seconds before it charges. This knowledge is your inheritance, passed down through generations of survival at the absolute edge of human endurance. But the choices you and your descendants will make over the next 15,000 years, where to walk, where to camp, which valley to follow when the herds move east, whether to launch the boats along the southern shore when the ice breaks in spring, all of it will eventually place human footprints at the southern tip of South America, populate 2 entire continents, and give rise to civilizations as magnificent as any the old world would produce. The pyramids of Teotihuacan, the road system of the Inca, the great earthworks of Cahokia, the astronomical precision of Maya calendars, all of it begins here, on this frozen riverbank, with a small band of hunters watching the mammoths move across the plain. This is the story of the most consequential migration in the history of our species. This is the crossing of Beringia. The world they left behind in northeastern Siberia had shaped them into the most accomplished cold-weather hunters the planet had ever produced. And the world ahead of them, vast and untouched, was waiting.
The world of 30,000 BC was a planet almost unrecognizable to modern eyes. The last glacial maximum had locked vast quantities of water in ice sheets kilometers thick, pressing down on the continents with their colossal weight, reshaping coastlines, redirecting rivers, and transforming the very face of the earth. Global sea levels stood 120 to 130 meters below where they are today, a difference so vast that it exposed entire continental shelves as dry land, creating new landscapes where ocean floor had been, while the ice above compressed the land beneath it into new shapes. The coastlines of every continent were different. The British Isles were attached to Europe. Southeast Asia was a vast peninsula extending far south of its current margins. Australia and New Guinea formed a single landmass. And in the far north, where the Pacific Ocean now separates two hemispheres, there was no ocean at all, only a great plain of grass and wind and ice, stretching unbroken from Siberia to Alaska. This was Beringia, not a narrow land bridge, but a subcontinent in its own right, stretching 1,600 kilometers from north to south at its widest extent, an area roughly equivalent to the American West. The name honors Vitus Bering, the Danish-born navigator who commanded Russian expeditions into these northern waters in the 18th century, and whose name now graces the strait that separates the two hemispheres, a strait that, during the Ice Age, did not exist. Bering would have had nothing to cross. He would simply have ridden his horse from Siberia into Alaska without getting his boots wet. But Beringia was not the frozen wasteland that its Arctic latitude might suggest. It was dominated by what ecologists call the Mammoth steppe, a biome that no longer exists anywhere on Earth, driven to extinction by the same climatic changes that would eventually open the path south into the Americas. This was a dry, cold grassland, kept dry by the same atmospheric patterns that maintained the great ice sheets, and its dryness was paradoxically the key to its productivity. The cold, dry conditions prevented the formation of the deep, waterlogged peat bogs that cover Arctic landscapes today. Instead, the frozen ground, the permafrost, remained firm underfoot, supporting a sward of productive grasses and sedges that could sustain enormous numbers of large herbivores. Recent estimates based on sediment core analysis and pollen records suggest that the Mammoth steppe supported herbivore biomass densities rivaling or exceeding those of the modern Serengeti. Woolly mammoths, steppe bison, wild horses, saiga antelopes, woolly rhinoceroses, and caribou in numbers that would stagger a modern observer. Imagine the plain from above, a vast, tawny expanse of grass and low sedge stretching from horizon to horizon, broken by the dark threads of rivers running east toward the sea that did not yet exist, and dotted by the small dark shapes of the great herds, mammoths traveling in matriarchal family groups of 8 to 12 individuals, the great curved tusks of the adult females catching the low Arctic sunlight, bison in herds of hundreds moving like a brown tide across the grassland, strings of wild horses cantering between the river valleys. Above this scene, a sky of crystalline Arctic clarity, the sun tracing a low arc that in summer barely dips below the horizon, bathing the landscape in that peculiar golden light that Arctic travelers describe as unlike any light in the south. And somewhere in this landscape, barely visible against the immensity of the plain, the small fires of human camps, the wisps of smoke rising straight in the windless morning air.
The story begins at the Yana rhinoceros horn site, discovered by Russian archaeologist Vladimir Patulko and excavated beginning in 2001. Located on the banks of the Yana River in the Sakha Republic, the vast diamond-shaped republic of northeastern Russia that occupies an area larger than India. This site sits at 71 degrees north latitude, a place so far north that the sun vanishes for months at a time, where winter temperatures plunge past minus 40 degrees Celsius, and the ground beneath your feet has been frozen solid for tens of thousands of years. The Yana River itself, dark and swift even in summer, runs north toward the Arctic Ocean through a landscape of sedge tundra and low shrubs, a landscape that in the modern era feels empty, but that approximately 31,600 years ago was a scene of human activity remarkable enough to rewrite the entire early history of the Americas. The artifacts recovered from Yana speak not of desperate struggle, but of accomplished mastery. The site's most spectacular objects are the foreshafts, the connecting pieces between a spear point and its main shaft, carved from woolly rhinoceros horn, a material that required considerable skill and knowledge to work. Horn is not a forgiving medium. It must be soaked and heated before it can be shaped, and the shaping itself demands patience, precision, and a clear understanding of the material's grain and tendency to split. That the Yana people were working rhinoceros horn, not the more commonly used antler or bone, speaks to a craftsman's knowledge of materials, an appreciation for the specific properties of different animal substances, and an aesthetic sensibility that chose the best available material for the job, regardless of difficulty. But it is the ivory needles that perhaps speak most directly to the sophistication of Yana culture. Some of the finest needles ever recovered from the Upper Paleolithic were found here. Delicate, precisely drilled instruments, so small they would not look out of place in a modern sewing kit. The existence of such needles tells us with certainty that these people were making tailored, fitted clothing, not simply wrapping themselves in hides, but cutting, shaping, and stitching garments to fit the human body, with seams placed to minimize heat loss and with multiple layers designed for warmth, moisture management, and freedom of movement. In the Arctic, clothing is not a luxury, it is survival technology, as critical to life as the spear or the fire. An inadequately dressed person in minus 40-degree cold will lose consciousness within 30 minutes and die within an hour. The Yana people's needles tell us they understood this perfectly and had solved the problem with engineering precision. The bones recovered from the site speak an equally eloquent language. Mammoth, steppe bison, horse, reindeer, wolf, the full complement of Beringian megafauna is represented in quantities that speak not of occasional opportunistic kills, but of organized, systematic hunting. Bringing down a woolly mammoth, an animal that might stand 3.5 meters at the shoulder and weigh 5 or 6 tons, requires coordinated group effort, careful planning, and the willingness to risk injury or death. The hunters of Yana were doing this regularly. They understood the psychology and behavior of the largest land animals on Earth, and they had developed the cooperative strategies, the communication, the trust between band members that such hunts required. These were not simple creatures blundering through the tundra. They were sophisticated social beings whose intelligence and skill was equal to any challenge their world presented.
Who were these people? They were part of the broad cultural horizon that archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Siberian tradition. Cold-adapted specialists who had been expanding northward for tens of thousands of years, following the herds, learning the landscape, developing the knowledge and technology to survive at the absolute edge of human endurance. Their ancestors had come from somewhere in Central or Eastern Asia, part of the great dispersal of modern humans, Homo sapiens, that had been spreading out from Africa for hundreds of thousands of years, filling the habitable world one landscape at a time. By the time their descendants stood on the banks of the Yana River, they had been adapting to cold environments for so many generations that the Arctic was no longer an extreme, it was simply home. Their tool traditions reveal a people who had thought deeply about the problem of survival in a nomadic world. Wedge-shaped microblade cores, small, carefully prepared pieces of stone from which dozens of tiny standardized cutting edges could be struck, were the foundation of their toolkit. These microblades could be set into handles of bone or antler to create composite tools of extraordinary versatility. Knives, scrapers, projectile points, engraving tools, all manufactured from the same basic technology. The advantage of this system was its efficiency. A hunter who knew how to prepare a wedge-shaped core could manufacture new cutting edges wherever he found suitable stone, carrying the knowledge rather than the tools themselves. In a landscape where stone outcrops were separated by hundreds of kilometers, this was not just convenience, it was survival intelligence. Burin tools, small chisel-like instruments made by striking a flake from the edge of a larger stone piece, were essential for working bone and antler. Antler is a remarkable material, tough, slightly flexible, capable of being shaped with heat and pressure into forms impossible to achieve in stone, and far more resistant to shattering than flint. The Yana people's mastery of antler and bone technology extended their toolkit enormously, allowing them to make things that pure stone technology could never produce. Needles fine enough to stitch watertight seams, fish hooks, harpoon heads with detachable points, the intricate foreshafts that connected stone points to wooden shafts. This was a technology of complexity and ingenuity, and it had been built up over generations of experiment, failure, and incremental improvement. These people could not afford to carry heavy, specialized equipment across hundreds of kilometers of tundra. Everything they made had to be lightweight, multi-purpose, and manufacturable from whatever stone they could find along the way. Their toolkits were, in essence, a survival philosophy made material, a philosophy that valued adaptability over specialization, that prioritized the knowledge to make things over the accumulation of things themselves. In this, the Upper Paleolithic Siberian hunters were operating according to a principle that modern engineers would recognize: design for the constraints of the operating environment, and when in doubt, make it lighter and more versatile. They had reached this wisdom not through abstract reasoning, but through the brutal instruction of the Arctic itself, which punished every mistake and rewarded every innovation. The landscape they inhabited was one of astonishing ecological richness, a world that existed nowhere else on Earth, the Mammoth steppe, a biome now vanished that stretched from Western Europe to Alaska in an unbroken sweep of cold grass and wind and animal life on a scale that beggars modern imagination. To be human in this landscape was to be part of an ecological web of stunning complexity, to understand the movements of the great herds not merely as a food source, but as the organizing principle of the entire world, the rhythm by which seasons were measured, by which camps were placed, by which the year itself was structured.
But paradise had its terrors. The same cold that preserved the Mammoth steppe and kept the great grasslands productive also meant that a single bad winter, a hunting failure, an injury to a key provider, a disease that swept through an isolated band of 20 or 30 people, could mean extinction for an entire community. Life on the Beringian plain was a constant negotiation between abundance and catastrophe, between the extraordinary richness of the megafaunal ecosystem and the brutal indifference of the Arctic climate to human survival. The predators that shared this landscape were monsters by any modern standard. The short-faced bear, Arctodus simus, stood 1.8 meters at the shoulder, eye level with a tall man when on all fours, and could run at 40 kilometers per hour on its long, relatively straight legs, which gave it a loping, almost cat-like gait, quite unlike the shuffling run of modern bears. Arctodus was not a browser or a generalist omnivore like modern grizzlies. It was an apex predator, with a skull architecture designed for maximum bite force and a body plan built for speed. When Arctodus decided to charge, there was nowhere to run. It was faster than any human being and nearly impossible to discourage with conventional weapons. Cave lions prowled in prides, ambushing prey from the low scrub that fringed the river valleys. Packs of steppe wolves, larger and heavier than modern gray wolves, followed the caribou migrations and were not above testing a lone human hunter who had strayed too far from camp. And then there was the weather. The open Beringian steppe offered no shelter from the storms that swept in without warning across the flat plain, blizzards that reduced visibility to zero and drove temperatures down to levels where exposed skin froze in minutes. A hunting party caught far from camp in such a storm faced death from exposure. The hunters of Yana would have known from childhood the signs of approaching weather, the particular quality of light before a storm, the behavior of the animals, the feel of the wind, and would have arranged their movements to minimize the risk. But risk could never be eliminated, only managed, and the margin between life and death in the Arctic was always measured in calories and degrees, with no surplus to waste. These were people who understood in their bones and in their cultural memory that the world was dangerous and generous in equal measure, and that survival demanded both skill and humility before the forces of wind, ice, and animal. They were not passive victims of circumstance. They were active agents who shaped their world through intelligence, cooperation, and the accumulated knowledge of generations. But they also knew, with the pragmatic wisdom of the truly experienced, that the world did not owe them survival, that every hunting success was also a narrow escape from failure, and that the respect owed to the animals they hunted and the landscape they traversed was not sentiment, but sound strategic thinking. The world of the Beringian hunter was one of extraordinary intimacy with the natural world, an intimacy born not of romanticism, but of absolute dependency, of the knowledge that every breath was borrowed from the generosity of the land. The cold was omnipresent and absolute, not the inconvenient cold of a northern city winter, where heated buildings and insulated clothing make it a matter of minor discomfort, but a cold that killed, that crept into any gap in clothing and turned flesh to stone within minutes, that froze river crossings solid and buried camps under meters of snow. And yet these people did not merely endure the cold, they mastered it, as no people before them had. Their clothing, their fire-making technology, their shelter-building skills, their knowledge of the nutritional value of different animal fats and proteins, all of it was the product of a long and brutal education at the hands of the Arctic itself.
Chapter 2. The Beringian Standstill, 10,000 years at the edge. Here is one of the most remarkable discoveries in the modern science of human origins, a finding that emerged not from the patient work of archaeological excavation, but from the cold mathematics of genetics. In 2007, a team led by Erica Tom and colleagues published a landmark paper in PLOS ONE that would fundamentally reshape our understanding of how and when the Americas were first peopled. The question they were asking was deceptively simple. When did the ancestors of Native Americans separate from their Asian relatives, and how long did they exist as an isolated population before entering the New World? The answer, written in the genetic sequences of living Native Americans and ancient skeletal remains, was both surprising and profound. The genetic signatures of Native Americans, the unique combinations of mitochondrial haplogroups, Y chromosome lineages, and autosomal DNA patterns that distinguish them from all other populations on Earth, were the product not of a simple, rapid migration from Asia into the Americas, but of thousands of years of isolation, during which a founding population had been diverged from its Asian relatives and accumulated its own genetic distinctiveness. The mathematics were unambiguous. The degree of genetic differentiation between Native Americans and their closest Asian relatives was far too great to have been produced by a migration that had occurred only 13,000 or 15,000 years ago. Something else had happened. The founding population had been isolated, cut off from gene flow with Asia for a far longer period. This period of isolation is now called the Beringian Standstill, and it may have lasted between 5,000 and 10,000 years. Not a pause, not a delay, a full geological chapter of time, during which the ancestors of all Native Americans lived in Beringia, gradually becoming their own people. The 5 mitochondrial haplogroups that mark all Native American populations, designated A, B, C, D, and X by geneticists, are the molecular fingerprints of the women who lived through the standstill. Haplogroups A, C, and D are found across northeastern Asia as well as throughout the Americas. B and X are rarer in Asia and more distinctively American. Together, these 5 lineages represent the maternal inheritance of the entire indigenous population of 2 continents. Every person who ever spoke Nahuatl, or Quechua, or Lakota, or Cherokee, every person who ever built a pyramid at Teotihuacan, or a cliff dwelling at Mesa Verde, or a longhouse in the Pacific Northwest, traces their maternal lineage back to the small group of women who lived through the Beringian Standstill. The genetic evidence does not merely suggest this, it demands it. There are no other maternal lineages in pre-contact Native American populations. The bottleneck was real, and it was severe. The implications of the Beringian Standstill hypothesis for our understanding of the peopling of the Americas are profound and still being worked out. If the founding population was isolated in Beringia for 5,000 to 10,000 years, as the genetic evidence demands, then the Americas were peopled not by a migration of Siberians who happened to cross a land bridge, but by a population that had already become distinct, already become its own people, with its own genetic profile, its own cultural traditions, and its own ecological knowledge accumulated during thousands of years of life on the Beringian plain. The first Americans were not Siberians who crossed into Alaska. They were Beringians, a people of the lost subcontinent who moved south into the Americas when the climate finally allowed it. This distinction matters. It means that the founding culture of the Americas was not simply a copy of a Siberian culture transplanted to a new location. It was something new, shaped by the unique pressures and opportunities of a unique environment during a period of isolation long enough to forge a genuinely distinct people. The Americas were not discovered by Siberians. They were built by Beringians.
What did this standstill mean in human terms? Imagine a population of perhaps a few hundred to a few thousand individuals, small enough that everyone knew everyone, that the loss of a single skilled hunter could be catastrophic, that marriage alliances between bands were matters of survival rather than sentiment, living for generation after generation on a great plain that was simultaneously a homeland and a trap. To the west, the vast distances of Siberia and the already populated territories of Asia. To the east and south, the towering ice walls of the Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets, impassable barriers of frozen rock that sealed off any path into the Americas. To the north, the Arctic Ocean, and beneath them, slowly and imperceptibly, the landmass of Beringia itself, changing as the climate shifted. These people were not waiting, they were living, hunting, gathering, raising children, burying their dead, telling stories around fires on winter nights, developing the ceremonies and the cosmologies and the social structures that would eventually be inherited, transformed, and built upon by their descendants across 2 continents. Every generation that passed added another layer to the accumulated cultural knowledge of the population, another set of observations about animal behavior, another understanding of plant resources, another improvement to hunting technology, another story that encoded in narrative form the hard-won ecological knowledge of people who had learned their landscape with their lives. The Beringian Standstill was not a period of cultural stagnation. It was, if anything, the opposite, a crucible of adaptation in which the specific cultural, technological, and cognitive toolkit that would eventually make the peopling of the Americas possible was being forged. Consider what those generations experienced and learned. The southern coast of Beringia, where the land met the North Pacific Ocean, offered access to marine resources that inland hunters had never exploited. Shellfish in the intertidal zones, sea mammals hauled out on beaches and rocky headlands, migratory fish in the river mouths. The people who moved to this coast would have had to develop entirely new technologies and skills, the ability to build waterproof containers, to make and use nets and hooks, to butcher marine mammals and render their fat, to read tides and currents and weather signs that had no equivalent in the inland steppe world they had come from. This was not a trivial adjustment, it was a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to be human in this particular landscape, and it took generations to accomplish. The psychological and social dimensions of this isolation deserve consideration as well. Small, isolated populations face specific pressures that larger, more connected ones do not. The constant threat of inbreeding depression, the vulnerability of having all your reproductive investment concentrated in a tiny number of individuals, the social tensions that arise when everyone knows everyone and grudges cannot be dissolved by simply moving to another village. The Beringian population survived these pressures. The genetic evidence tells us they did, but the survival was not guaranteed. Population genetic models suggest that the effective population size may have dipped at some point during the standstill to a few hundred breeding individuals or fewer. At such small sizes, the difference between survival and extinction is often a matter of chance.
And the people of Beringia were learning. Their genetic isolation from the rest of Asia meant that their cultural traditions, too, were developing along their own lines, accumulating the specific knowledge and technologies that would, eventually, make the crossing of an entire continent possible. The Beringian Standstill was not merely a genetic event, it was a cultural crucible, a period during which the founding population of the Americas was shaped by its unique environment into something new. Not simply a transplanted Siberian culture, but a distinctly Beringian one, adapted to a world of extreme cold, coastal resources, and the slow, grinding pressure of isolation. The ecological intelligence these people were accumulating was of a very specific and practical kind. They were learning the southern coast of Beringia, a coastline that would eventually become the first section of the Kelp Highway that led south into the Americas. They were learning where the sea mammals holed out, where the salmon ran in summer, where the shellfish beds were richest and most reliable. They were learning to read the North Pacific weather, to understand when the fog was safe and when the swell was dangerous, to navigate by stars and landmarks and the behavior of seabirds. This knowledge was not written down. It was encoded in stories, in ceremonies, in the spatial memory of people who knew their landscape with the precision of those who had staked their lives on that knowledge, generation after generation. the 5 mitochondrial haplogroups that mark all Native American populations, A, B, C, D, and X, were crystallizing during this period into the lineages that geneticists can still read in the DNA of living people from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. The women who carried these haplogroups were ordinary people living ordinary lives, bearing children, processing hides, gathering plant foods, maintaining the social bonds that held their small bands together, arguing over the distribution of meat from a successful hunt, mourning their dead, celebrating new births. They had no idea that their descendants would one day build Tenochtitlan and Machu Picchu and Cahokia, that their mitochondrial lineages would be read by scientists with instruments they could not imagine, that the great migration they were beginning would be called the most consequential demographic event in human history. They were simply surviving. And in surviving, they were becoming the ancestors of 2 continents. The Beringian Standstill ended not with a dramatic crossing, but with a gradual shift as the climate began to warm after about 18,000 years ago, as the ice sheets began their long retreat, as the coastal margins of the North Pacific began to open to southward movement. The population that had been contained in Beringia for thousands of years began, slowly and then with gathering momentum, to move. The gene pool they carried with them, those 5 haplogroups, those specific Y chromosome lineages, that unique combination of autosomal variants, would become the genetic foundation of every indigenous civilization the Americas would ever produce. The standstill was over. The Great Migration was beginning. A 2018 study by Moreno Mayar and colleagues analyzing 15 ancient genomes from sites across the Americas ranging in age from 10,900 to 700 years old found evidence of 2 distinct founding lineages among the earliest Americans, a finding that suggests the founding population may have split into 2 groups while still in Beringia, or in the earliest stages of the southward migration. One lineage, the ancient Beringians, appears to have remained in Alaska and northwestern Canada for thousands of years before eventually being replaced by the spread of later populations. The other, the ancestral Native Americans, moved south rapidly and gave rise to all indigenous populations from Canada to Patagonia.
Chapter 3. The Thaw, when the world began to open.
Beginning approximately 18,000 years ago, the climate began its long, grinding shift toward the world we know, a shift so momentous in its consequences that geologists have given it a name, the last glacial termination. This was not a single dramatic event, not a sudden warming that swept across the planet in a decade or a century. It was a centuries-long, millennia-long process of warming, punctuated by cold reversals and sudden thaws, during which the great ice sheets retreated millimeter by millimeter, year by year, releasing their grip on the land and the sea with all the slow, implacable power of geological time. Sea levels began to rise as glacial meltwater poured into the oceans. The rivers of Beringia ran higher and colder as the surrounding snowpack melted for the first time in thousands of years. The frozen margins of the continent began to soften, revealing bedrock scoured bare by the passage of ice. The process was neither smooth nor linear. Climate scientists studying ice cores drilled from the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets have identified dozens of abrupt climate events within the last glacial termination, rapid warmings of several degrees in a few decades, followed by equally rapid coolings, oscillations between glacial and near interglacial conditions that must have been deeply disruptive to ecosystems and the human populations that depended on them. The Younger Dryas event, approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, was perhaps the most dramatic of these reversals, a sudden return to near glacial cold, possibly triggered by a massive influx of fresh water from melting North American ice sheets into the North Atlantic, which disrupted ocean circulation and plunged the Northern Hemisphere back into a cold that lasted more than 1,000 years. The people who had begun to move south along the coast of the Americas encountered a world that was not simply warming, but oscillating, shifting, presenting new landscapes and then withdrawing them, opening paths and then closing them again, with the caprice of a climate system in transition. But the overall trend was unmistakable. The ice was retreating, the seas were rising, and the southern coast of Beringia, the stretch of coastline along the northern margin of the Pacific Ocean where the land met the sea, was becoming, for the first time in thousands of years, accessible to southward movement. Initially, this coastal zone was an inhospitable world of raw glacial landscape, rocks scoured bare by ice, meltwater streams cutting new channels through the bedrock, the ocean itself disturbed and turbid with glacial flour, the fine rock dust produced by glaciers grinding across the underlying stone. But biological colonization is relentless, and life moved into these newly exposed environments with extraordinary speed. Into the raw, ice-scraped landscape came the first colonizers, mosses and lichens anchoring themselves to bare rock, sedges taking hold in the thin soils accumulating in sheltered hollows, willow and alder shrubs following within decades or centuries of deglaciation. The pollen record, preserved in sediment cores from Beringian lakes and bogs, tells this story in exquisite botanical detail. The shift from the grass and sedge pollen that dominated during the cold, dry Mammoth steppe maximum to the rising proportions of alder and birch and willow pollen that mark the expansion of shrub tundra as the climate warmed. This transition was not a comfortable one for the people who had built their lives around the Mammoth steppe ecosystem. The great herds were declining, mammoths, steppe bison, horses retreating northward and eastward as their preferred grassland habitat shrank, their populations thinning and fragmenting as the ecosystem that had sustained them for hundreds of thousands of years dissolved beneath the warming influence of a post-glacial world.
But the thaw also opened doors that had never existed before. As the Cordilleran ice sheet, the glaciation that had covered the mountains of western North America, began to melt, and as the Laurentide ice sheet that blanketed the continental interior also retreated, the southern coast of Beringia and the coast of what would become British Columbia began to open to human movement in ways that had been impossible during the height of the glaciation. This was a coastal world being born in real time, new beaches emerging from beneath receding ice, new river mouths forming as meltwater found its way to the sea, new intertidal zones colonized by shellfish and seaweed within years of the ice's retreat. The kelp forests were among the first and most important biological communities to establish themselves in the newly deglaciated coastal zones. Giant kelp, Macrocystis porifera, can grow at rates of up to 60 centimeters per day under favorable conditions, and a mature kelp forest can reach canopy heights of 30 meters or more. These forests are among the most productive marine ecosystems on Earth, generating vast quantities of organic matter that cascade through the food web, supporting extraordinary densities of fish, invertebrates, and marine mammals. Wherever the North Pacific coast offered suitable rocky substrate and cold, nutrient-rich water, kelp forests established themselves, and with them came the full community of associated species: sea urchins grazing on kelp holdfasts, sea otters preying on sea urchins, harbor seals lounging on exposed rocks, orca cutting through the channels between islands. For a coastal population with the knowledge and technology to exploit these resources, the newly opened Pacific coast was a world of almost unlimited abundance.
The archaeological evidence confirms that people were present along the coast of southeastern Alaska and British Columbia by at least 13,000 years ago, and possibly earlier. The On Your Knees cave site on Prince of Wales Island in southeastern Alaska, where a young man now known by the Tlingit name Shukaka'a, meaning man ahead of us, was buried approximately 10,300 years ago, provides direct evidence of a maritime-adapted coastal population. His diet, reconstructed from stable isotope analysis of his bones, was predominantly marine, fish, sea mammals, and shellfish. The tools buried with him included microblades and bifaces, suggesting a technology with deep roots in the Beringian tradition, adapted to the specific demands of coastal life. His ancient genome, sequenced in 2015, placed him within the coastal lineage that descends directly from the first migrants to move south along the Pacific coast, a man who stood at the beginning of the coastal tradition that would eventually give rise to the magnificent maritime cultures of the Pacific Northwest. The islands of Haida Gwaii, the archipelago off the northern coast of British Columbia, long known as the Queen Charlotte Islands, played a special role in this story. During the last glacial maximum, much of this archipelago was ice-free, forming a refugium where plants and animals, and possibly people, could survive while the surrounding landscape was buried beneath glaciers. The bears of Haida Gwaii have a distinct genetic lineage separate from mainland brown bears, suggesting a long period of island isolation during the Ice Age. The archaeology of the island's coastal margins, where evidence of early human presence lies submerged beneath the risen sea, is being actively investigated by researchers working with the Haida Nation, a collaboration that represents the growing partnership between Western science and indigenous knowledge in reconstructing this foundational chapter of human history.
The pressure from the interior was real and growing. As the Mammoth steppe collapsed and the megafauna declined, the interior of Beringia became less and less capable of supporting the hunting populations that had lived there for millennia. The change was not sudden. It unfolded over centuries and generations, imperceptible in any individual lifetime, but unmistakable in its cumulative effect. The grasslands that had once blackened the horizon with herds of bison and mammoth were giving way to shrub tundra, willow and dwarf birch replacing the productive sedge grassland, the permafrost beginning to thaw in places, creating the waterlogged, tusky terrain that makes Arctic travel so difficult today. The great herds were thinning, the hunts were less reliable, the caloric calculus of life on the interior steppe were shifting against the people who had depended on it. People who moved to the coast found a world of extraordinary productivity. The North Pacific kelp ecosystem is among the most biologically rich marine environments on Earth, concentrating enormous biomass along a narrow coastal strip. A single productive bay could yield more food in a day than a week of interior hunting during the lean seasons. But exploiting coastal resources required new skills, the ability to build watercraft capable of navigating coastal waters, to make and set nets and fish traps, to harvest shellfish in the intertidal zone without being caught by incoming tides, to butcher and preserve marine mammals whose anatomy and behavior were entirely unlike anything encountered on the inland steppe. The transition from interior hunting to coastal foraging was not instantaneous. It was a learning process that took generations as bands experimented with new techniques, shared knowledge across the social networks that connected them, and gradually accumulated the coastal expertise that would make the Kelp Highway migration possible. The coastal migration was not a grand decision, not a conscious act of exploration driven by curiosity or ambition.
It was, as all great human migrations have been, the aggregate of 10,000 individual choices made by 10,000 individual people in response to the immediate realities of survival, where the food was, where the weather was survivable, where the next generation could be raised in safety. No individual who participated in the southward movement along the North Pacific coast knew that they were participating in a continental migration. They were making camp in a bay that had more shellfish than the one they had left, following a school of salmon up a river they had not seen before, spending the winter in a place where the weather was slightly less brutal than the exposed coast to the north. Each individual choice was small, rational, and local. The cumulative effect was the peopling of 2 continents. What is extraordinary, and what the archaeological and genetic evidence forces us to confront, is the speed with which this process unfolded once it began. The coastal margins of the North Pacific, once ice-free and productive, channeled human movement southward with remarkable efficiency. The kelp forests provided continuous food along the entire route. The coastal topography provided natural waypoints and shelter. The maritime technology that the Beringians had been developing along their coastline for generations provided the means of movement. When the path south opened, the people who were positioned to take it were ready, not because they had planned for it, but because they had spent thousands of years becoming exactly the kind of people who could.
Chapter 4. The Kelp Highway, Racing the Coast of a New World. Jon Erlandson of the University of Oregon has called it the Kelp Highway, and the name captures something essential about what made the coastal migration possible. Kelp forests, those vast underwater canopies of giant brown algae that grow along the rocky coastlines of the temperate Pacific, are among the most productive ecosystems on Earth, rivaling tropical rainforests in their biological richness and far exceeding them in the density and accessibility of their animal communities. From the waters around Japan, across the Aleutian Islands, along the coast of Alaska and British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest, and south all the way to Baja California, kelp forests formed a nearly continuous band of marine productivity along the rim of the Pacific Ocean, a band that, during the period of the coastal migration, extended along coastlines that were in some cases hundreds of kilometers seaward of their modern positions, because sea levels were still lower than today. This was not merely a route, it was a superhighway of food, shellfish beds packed into every protected bay and rocky headland, sea urchins grazing in dense carpets on the kelp holdfasts, rockfish and lingcod sheltering in the forest canopy, halibut resting on the sandy bottom in the channels between islands, seal and sea lion rookeries on every suitable beach, sea otters floating in the surface canopy of kelp beds, seabird colonies numbering in the hundreds of thousands on the rocky outer islets. The North Pacific coast, for people with the knowledge and technology to exploit it, was the richest food environment on Earth at the time of the coastal migration, and it extended in an essentially unbroken corridor from Alaska to the southern tip of Baja California, a distance of more than 7,000 kilometers. The technology that made the Kelp Highway navigable is largely invisible in the archaeological record. Wood rots, hide decays, and the coastal sites where evidence of early watercraft might have been preserved now lie tens of meters beneath the surface of the risen ocean. But we know from multiple lines of indirect evidence that the coastal migrants had watercraft. The Channel Islands off the coast of California, which required a minimum water crossing of 8 kilometers even at glacial low-stand sea levels, were reached by humans approximately 13,000 years ago.
The genetics of coastal populations across the entire length of the Pacific coast show patterns consistent with rapid maritime dispersal rather than slow overland movement. And the ethnographic record of the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest provides the most compelling testimony. The Haida of Haida Gwaii, the Tlingit of southeastern Alaska, the Nuu-chah-nulth of Vancouver Island, people who built ocean-going canoes 60 feet long from single cedar logs, who navigated open water hundreds of kilometers from the nearest land, who possessed astronomical and meteorological knowledge encoded in generations of practice. These peoples represent a maritime tradition so ancient and so sophisticated that it could only be the accumulated inheritance of people who had been living on and from the ocean for 15,000 years or more. The Aleutian Islands played a crucial role in this story. This volcanic archipelago, stretching 1,900 kilometers from the tip of the Alaska Peninsula to the Commander Islands off the Kamchatka coast of Russia, was one of the first coastal corridors to open as the glaciers retreated. The Aleutians are geologically young, volcanically active, and surrounded by some of the richest marine waters on Earth. The confluence of the cold Bering Sea to the north and the somewhat warmer North Pacific to the south create upwelling conditions that drive extraordinary biological productivity.
Imagine the experience of moving south along this coast for the first time, or rather for the 10,000th time, as generations of people repeated and extended the southward movement begun by their ancestors. Every campsite was a discovery, every new bay a revelation of abundance unlike anything seen farther north. A rocky headland covered in mussel beds, the mussels so thick and so large that a family could gather enough for a week's eating in a single tide. A river mouth where Chinook salmon, the largest of the Pacific salmon species, ran in such numbers that the surface of the water churned with their bodies. Fish so large and so fat with accumulated ocean energy that a single animal could provide enough calories for a day's hard travel. A sheltered cove where sea otters floated on their backs, cracking urchins on stones balanced on their chests, so unafraid of the approaching humans that they watched with calm, liquid eyes as the hunters launched their boats. The Americas they were entering had never known human hunters. This fact is so fundamental that it is easy to understate its significance. In Africa, where human beings had been hunting large game for millions of years, the megafauna had co-evolved with hominins. They had learned over countless generations to be afraid of the upright creatures with their tools and their coordinated attacks. In Eurasia, the same process had played out more recently, but still over tens of thousands of years. The animals of Africa and Eurasia knew in the deepest evolutionary sense that humans were dangerous. They fled, they concealed themselves, they developed behavioral strategies, alarm calls, flight distances, the tendency to avoid open ground that minimized their vulnerability to human predation. The animals of the Americas had no such evolutionary experience. They had not the faintest instinctive understanding of what a human being was or what it was capable of. The accounts of early European explorers encountering previously uncontacted wildlife in the Americas, accounts of animals that allowed humans to walk up and touch them, of birds that would not fly even when companions were killed nearby, of sea mammals that lay on beaches in total indifference to approaching people. These accounts describe precisely what the first coastal migrants would have experienced 15,000 years before Columbus. The seals lay in the sun and let people walk up to them. The sea lions did not scatter when a boat approached. The fish filled the rivers so thick in season that you could almost walk across their backs. The sea otters floated and watched with calm curiosity. This was a world of tame, abundant, harvestable wildlife on a scale that no human population in Eurasia or Africa had experienced in living memory.
a world that rewarded the bold, the capable, and superbly equipped with abundance beyond imagining. And the migrants were bold, capable, and superbly equipped. They had their boats, likely skin-covered frames of the type still built by Arctic peoples today, light enough to carry over portages, seaworthy enough to navigate coastal waters in moderate conditions, fast enough to pursue sea mammals and cover significant distances in a day's paddling. They had their composite spears, their knives, their knowledge of how to butcher and process every kind of animal they encountered. They had thousands of years of coastal experience behind them, encoded in the knowledge of the elders, the stories told around winter fires, the accumulated ecological intelligence of a people who had learned the North Pacific coast from the ground up. When they moved south into the new world of the Americas, they moved as masters of their environment, and the environment rewarded them with everything they could have wanted.
The speed of the coastal migration, once it began in earnest, was breathtaking, and it is one of the most important and least appreciated facts about the peopling of the Americas. From Alaska to the tip of Baja California is roughly 5,000 kilometers by coast. From there, the coast of Central America adds another 2,000 kilometers, and the coast of South America extends an additional 10,000 kilometers to Tierra del Fuego. And yet, the oldest, well-dated archaeological site in South America, Monte Verde in southern Chile, dates to approximately 14,800 years ago, just over 1,200 years after the earliest estimated date for human presence in ice-free coastal Alaska. If those dates are correct, and they are among the most thoroughly tested in American archaeology, then people covered more than 15,000 kilometers of coastline in little more than 1,000 years, an average southward movement of more than 12 kilometers per year. This is not an implausible rate for coastal maritime peoples exploiting a continuous and productive shoreline. Modern hunter-gatherers with boats regularly range hundreds of kilometers in a season, moving between seasonal resource patches with the ease that only watercraft can provide. A population that was growing, as founding populations typically do when entering a new, resource-rich environment, would have experienced the constant social pressure to expand its range as younger families and smaller subordinate bands pushed the frontier southward to find territories not yet claimed by established groups. Each generation might extend the southern limit of human settlement by only a few dozen kilometers, but across 1,000 years, those incremental advances add up to a continental migration. What the archaeological record cannot tell us, what lies beyond the reach of any scientific instrument, is what those people experienced as they moved. The emotional content of that southward journey, the terror and exhilaration of rounding a new headland and seeing before you a coast that stretched to an unimaginably distant horizon, the grief of losing a child to the cold Pacific waters, the joy of a season in which the salmon ran so thick that every family ate well and the racks were full of drying fish for the winter ahead. The stories told around evening fires about the lands to the north, about the grandparents and great-grandparents who had camped on shores that now lay 1,000 kilometers behind. The first Americans were fully human in every sense, emotional, social, creative, curious, and their migration was not merely a demographic statistic, but a human story of extraordinary richness. The archaeological sites that document this migration are scattered along the Pacific coast like pearls on a string, many of them submerged beneath the risen sea, accessible only to marine archaeologists working from boats, but enough of them preserved in fortunate geological circumstances to sketch the outline of the story. The Arlington site on Santa Rosa Island, one of the Channel Islands of California, produced human bones dated to approximately 13,000 years ago,
bones belonging to a person who had reached the islands by boat, who had crossed open water to reach a place of extraordinary abundance. The Daisy Cave site on San Miguel Island, dated to approximately 11,500 years ago, produced evidence of intensive exploitation of marine resources, shellfish, fish bones, the remains of seabirds taken at sea. These are fragments of a much larger story, a story that begins with a handful of people on the Beringian coast and ends 15,000 years later with a hemisphere full of human civilization.
Chapter 5. Monte Verde, the oldest footprint in a new world.
At the edge of a small creek in south-central Chile, in a place that would one day be called Monte Verde, a group of people made camp approximately 14,800 years ago. They chose their campsite with care, a sheltered spot along Chinchiguapi Creek where the banks were stable and the creek itself provided fresh water and access to the aquatic resources of the surrounding wetland. They built shelters, rectangular structures framed with wooden poles driven into the soft ground, their walls and roofs covered with animal hides stretched tight against the southern Chilean wind. The floors were strewn with plant materials gathered from the surrounding landscape, grasses, reeds, the leaves of plants that the site's excavator, Tom Dillihay of Vanderbilt University, would eventually identify as representing at least 45 different species gathered from an area extending more than 700 kilometers in every direction. They cooked meat from mastodons, the New World cousins of the Old World mammoths, enormous creatures with shaggy brown fur and long curved tusks that browsed the forests and wetlands of South America in their millions. Mastodon bones at Monte Verde show cut marks from stone tools and patterns of deliberate disarticulation, evidence that these people were not merely scavenging, but were processing whole animals, extracting marrow from bones, separating joints for transport, rendering fat for cooking and waterproofing. They were skilled hunters who understood the anatomy of their prey and knew how to extract maximum nutritional value from every part of the carcass. The mastodon bones they left behind are among the most remarkable artifacts at the site, direct physical evidence of a megafaunal hunting culture at the very far end of its range, at the southern tip of a continent that these people's ancestors had entered from the north, perhaps only a few centuries before. The plant remains at Monte Verde speak to a level of ecological knowledge that astonishes modern researchers. Among the species identified were wild potatoes, ancestor of one of the world's most important food crops, various species of seaweed gathered from Pacific coastal sites more than 90 kilometers away, some of which have documented medicinal uses in modern Mapuche traditional medicine, and plants from the Andean foothills more than 700 kilometers to the east, suggesting either seasonal movements of remarkable range or trade networks connecting Monte Verde to distant communities. This was not a group of desperate wanderers scratching a living at the edge of the known world. It was a sophisticated, well-connected community with extensive knowledge of its landscape and established relationships, whether through trade or seasonal movement, with distant places and peoples. One of them, we do not know if it was a child or an adult, a man or a woman, pressed a foot into soft clay beside the creek and left a print there, preserved for 14,800 years, beneath a blanket of waterlogged peat, waiting to be found. When Tom Dillihay first encountered that print during the excavations of Monte Verde in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the moment carried a weight of time that is almost impossible to convey. Here was the most intimate possible contact with a human being who had stood on this spot when woolly mammoths still walked the earth,
when the great ice sheets still covered much of the northern hemisphere, when the civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia lay 6,000 years in the future. That individual had stood here on the bank of this creek in this specific place, and their presence had been preserved by the accident of geology, the waterlogged peat that covered the site acting as a natural time capsule, sealing organic materials that would normally rot within decades or centuries.
Monte Verde is the oldest generally accepted archaeological site in the Americas, and its significance to the story of human migration cannot be overstated. For decades before its acceptance by the scientific mainstream in 1997, the established consensus in American archaeology insisted that the Clovis people, named for the site near Clovis, New Mexico, where their distinctive fluted spear points were first discovered and associated with mammoth bones in the 1930s, were the first Americans. The Clovis first model held that these people had arrived via the ice-free corridor between the retreating Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets approximately 13,500 years ago, spreading rapidly across North America and eventually reaching South America. It was a clean, elegant story with good evidence behind it. For 60 years, it dominated American archaeology with the force of a paradigm, and paradigms, as the philosopher Thomas Kuhn observed, die hard. Monte Verde shattered that model with the blunt force of physical reality. Here was a site in southern Chile at 41 degrees south latitude, more than 15,000 kilometers from the Bering Strait by any coastal route, dated by multiple independent radiocarbon assays to at least 14,800 years ago, before the ice-free corridor had even opened, at a time when the path through the North American interior was still blocked by thousands of meters of ice. The dates could not be wrong. They had been checked and rechecked by multiple laboratories using multiple methods. The archaeological context was impeccable. Dillehay had spent nearly 2 decades documenting the stratigraphy and the associations, and a panel of skeptical archaeologists who visited the site in 1997 to assess it directly came away convinced. Monte Verde was pre-Clovis. People had been in the Americas before the Clovis people. The Clovis first model was wrong. The implications cascaded through the field. If people were at Monte Verde in southern Chile by 14,800 years ago, they must have been in Alaska at least 15,000 to 16,000 years ago, possibly earlier. If they arrived before the ice-free corridor opened, they must have come by another route. The coastal Kelp Highway, long proposed but always secondary to the corridor model, suddenly became not just a hypothesis, but a necessity. And if the coastal route was the primary pathway, then the dates of arrival in the Americas needed to be pushed back, perhaps significantly back, from the 13,500 years that had seemed so well established. The field of American archaeology was forced to confront the possibility that much of its accumulated certainty was wrong, and to begin again, with fresh eyes, looking for the evidence that would tell the true story. Subsequent pre-Clovis sites have continued to accumulate in the decades since 1997, each one adding another chapter to the story of the first Americans. Paisley Caves in Oregon, where human coprolites, fossilized facies bearing ancient DNA, were dated to approximately 14,300 years ago, demonstrating human presence on the Oregon Plateau before Clovis. The Deborah L. Friedkin site in Texas, where lithic assemblages dated to approximately 15,500 years ago, lay beneath a layer of Clovis materials, suggesting a pre-Clovis technological tradition in the interior of North America. And most controversially, the White Sands footprints in New Mexico, approximately 88 human footprints spanning multiple soil layers, dated by multiple independent methods to between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. A finding that, if confirmed, would place humans in the American Southwest during the very height of the last glacial maximum, when the interior of the continent was covered by ice. The story of the first Americans grows more ancient, more complex, and more astonishing with each passing year of research.
The materials preserved at Monte Verde speak to us across 15 millennia with startling intimacy, a directness of contact that no written record, however ancient, can quite match. The waterlogged peat that buried the site within decades of its abandonment acted as a natural preservative, sealing organic materials in a state of remarkable completeness. Wooden tent pegs still in the positions where they were driven into the ground, knotted grass rope with the knots still tied, pieces of animal hide bearing traces of the fat that had been rubbed into them to preserve and waterproof them. The preserved remains of a mastodon tusk, gnawed at the edges where someone had worked patiently to extract the ivory, someone who sat here on this ground, working with a stone tool in an act of craft so ordinary and so human that the distance of 15,000 years collapses into nothing. The medicinal plants are perhaps the most extraordinary of all the Monte Verde materials. Seaweed gathered from the Pacific coast, identified by ethnobotanists as having uses consistent with traditional medicine in the region. Herbs and roots whose modern Mapuche names encode knowledge that has been passed down through an unbroken chain of generations, reaching back perhaps to the very people who gathered them here. The presence of these plants at Monte Verde tells us that the people who lived here already had a sophisticated pharmacological knowledge, that they understood which plants could reduce fever, which could treat infected wounds, which could ease the pain of childbirth. This knowledge was not invented at Monte Verde. It had been accumulated over thousands of years of observation and experiment, and it arrived at this place already mature, already a functioning system of medical practice. The first Americans were not primitive. They were knowledgeable in ways that we are only beginning to appreciate. The archaeology of Monte Verde forces us to confront the full humanity of its inhabitants in a way that dry statistics about migration routes and carbon-14 dates never can. These were people who built homes, not windbreaks or temporary shelters, but rectangular structures with defined floor areas, internal hearths, sleeping areas strewn with plant materials for comfort and insulation. They maintained separate areas of the site for different activities, one area for food preparation, another for tool manufacture, a separate small structure slightly apart from the main occupation area, whose function remains debated, but which contained unusual concentrations of medicinal plants and animal bones, suggesting a ritual or healing context. They organized their living space with the precision and intentionality of people who expected to be in one place for a significant period, who were creating a home rather than simply making camp. And then there is the child's footprint. In one small area of the site, near a hearth, in clay that was soft enough to accept an impression, a child pressed their foot into the ground, and the ground remembered. Standing over that print, Tom Dillehay has written, he felt something beyond the normal distance of scientific detachment, a sudden, visceral sense of presence, of contact across time. That child walked here. They stood in this spot. They looked out at the same creek, the same hills, the same rain-heavy southern Chilean sky that Dillehay was looking at as he crouched over the impression. They were real as any of us, with a life as full and as complicated and as precious as any life that has ever been lived. The crossing of Beringia, the peopling of the Americas, the grand sweep of geological and demographic history, all of it comes down, in the end, to this: a child's footprint in clay, preserved by the mercy of accident, waiting 15,000 years to be found.
Chapter 6. The Clovis People.
Hunters of the interior.
While some of the first Americans moved south along the coast, threading their way through the kelp forests and island chains of the Pacific margin, others, or perhaps their descendants, moving inland after the ice retreated, pushed into the vast interior of the continent. Around 13,500 years ago, a distinctive and beautiful technology appeared across North America with a suddenness that puzzles and excites archaeologists to this day: the Clovis Point. Named for the site near Clovis, New Mexico, where the first examples were identified in the 1930s in association with the bones of mammoths and extinct horses. Clovis points are fluted spear points, large bifacial stone tools worked to extraordinary thinness and symmetry, with a distinctive groove or flute napped into the base that allowed them to be hafted into a split spear shaft with a lashing of sinew. They are among the most technically demanding stone tools ever made. To make a Clovis point is an act that requires not just skill, but courage. The fluting, the removal of a long, thin flake from the base of an already thin biface, is the most dangerous operation in stone knapping, with a high probability of shattering the entire tool if anything goes wrong. The fluting stroke must be delivered with precisely calibrated force and at exactly the right angle, using a carefully prepared platform, with the knowledge that a slight error will destroy hours of previous work. That the Clovis people fluted their points when they didn't have to, unfluted bifaces are equally effective as spear tips, suggests that the flute had become a cultural marker, a symbol of identity and skill, a statement about who these people were and what they valued. The beauty of a finished Clovis point, the mirror-like symmetry, the paper-thin edges, the careful thinning across both faces goes beyond functional requirement. These are objects made with pride, made by people who cared about the quality of their work in a way that transcends pure utilitarianism. Clovis points have been found from Alaska to Venezuela, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, a continental distribution achieved in less than 1,000 years by a population that, at its beginning, was certainly numbering no more than a few thousand individuals. This explosion of a single technological tradition across 2 million square kilometers of landscape is one of the great puzzles of American archaeology. It speaks to the mobility of the Clovis people, their willingness and ability to move vast distances across landscapes that no human being had ever traversed before, but also to the nature of the world they were entering. The interior of North America at 13,000 years ago was a hunter's paradise of staggering proportions, a continent-sized game park in which every valley and plain was stocked with megafauna that had never learned to fear the human hunter. For people with Clovis technology, the finest large animal hunting weapons ever made, this world was an open invitation to move, to explore, to kill, to eat, and to grow. The interior of North America that the Clovis people entered through the gradually opening ice-free corridor was a landscape of staggering dimensions and ecological richness. East of the Rocky Mountains, the Great Plains extended for more than 2,000 kilometers, covered in a mosaic of grassland and parkland, broken by great rivers, the Missouri, the Platte, the Arkansas, flowing east toward the Mississippi. The eastern half of the continent was covered in dense deciduous and coniferous forest, a world of shadow and leaf mold and running streams, utterly unlike the open steppe of Beringia. Between these great biomes lay a zone of transition that, in ecological terms, is often the most productive of all, the forest edge, where deer and elk grazed the meadows and retreated to the forest margins for cover, where the browsing mastodons found the shrubs and small trees they preferred, where the diversity of plant species was greatest and the density of animal life correspondingly high.
The interior of North America at 13,000 years ago was a hunter's paradise of staggering proportions, an ecosystem so rich and so strange that no modern landscape can serve as its analog. Columbian mammoths, the southern cousins of the woolly mammoth, standing 4 meters at the shoulder and weighing up to 10 tons, roamed the grasslands and woodlands of the continent's heartland in numbers that by some estimates ran into the hundreds of thousands. Mastodons browsed the forest edges of the eastern woodlands, their shaggy brown forms moving through stands of spruce and fir in the same placid, unhurried way that modern elephants move through the African bush. Ground sloths, the size of modern elephants, moved ponderously through the undergrowth of the Gulf Coast lowlands. Their enormous claws, evolved for pulling down branches rather than for digging, leaving tracks in the soft soil that would have seemed to a hunter seeing them for the first time like the footprints of some creature from the edge of nightmare. Glyptodonts, relatives of armadillos, encased in bony shells the size of small cars, their tails armored with spikes like a medieval flail, grazed the southern plains. American camels, which had evolved in North America before being hunted to extinction there and spreading to Asia and Africa as their descendants, moved through the open woodlands and grasslands in family groups. Horses that had evolved in North America long before their reintroduction by the Spanish in the 16th century grazed the Great Plains in herds that would not be seen again until the Comanche and the Lakota rode to reintroduced Spanish horses 400 years after the original horse's extinction. American cheetahs, built for speed rather than stalking, coursed across the open grasslands after their fast prey. Short-faced bears patrolled the river margins. American lions, larger than any living cat, hunted in prides. Dire wolves coursed in packs. Saber-toothed cats ambushed from cover. This was a world of genuine monsters, and the Clovis people walked into it with stone-tipped spears and killed it. The hunting strategies of the Clovis people were adapted to this world of large, naive prey. At Murray Springs in Arizona, Lenner Ranch in Arizona, and Blackwater Draw in New Mexico, all Clovis sites with excellent preservation, the bones of mammoths and horses bear the cut marks and percussion fractures of systematic butchery, together with the stone tools left behind by hunters who had eaten their fill and moved on. The hunting methods probably involved driving animals into boggy ground or toward water where their mobility was compromised, then attacking with thrusting and throwing spears at close range. The atlatl, the spear thrower, a simple device that effectively extends the throwing arm and multiplies the velocity and power of a thrown spear, may already have been in use, though direct evidence is scarce. What is not scarce is the evidence of the killing itself. Mammoth after mammoth, horse after horse, bearing the stone signatures of Clovis hunters who pursued them across a continent and left their distinctive tools beside the bones. What the Clovis kill sites reveal, beyond the simple fact of the killing, is a hunting culture of extraordinary sophistication. The Nico site in Arizona, excavated in the 1950s, yielded 8 Clovis points associated with the bones of a single mammoth, a concentration that speaks to a hunt in which multiple hunters attacked a single animal from different angles, driving their spears into vital organs until the great creature went down. The Lenner Ranch site, also in Arizona, contained the remains of at least 13
15 mammoths, horses, tapirs, and bison, together with 13 Clovis points and a variety of butchering tools, the debris of a kill event so productive that it may have attracted multiple bands to a single location, creating a temporary aggregation of people who normally lived in isolated family groups spread across hundreds of kilometers.
The Anzic child tells us something profound about the Clovis people, something that goes beyond hunting technology and stone tool traditions into the inner life of a community that existed at the dawn of American civilization. Discovered in 1968 near Wilsall, Montana, by two construction workers who were excavating a hillside, this infant, perhaps 12 to 18 months old when he died, was buried with extraordinary care approximately 12,600 years ago. His grave contained more than 100 stone and bone artifacts, all coated with red ochre, Clovis points of exquisite workmanship, foreshafts of polished bone, bifaces, and other tools representing enormous investments of time and skill. The sheer quantity of grave goods is remarkable. An adult Clovis hunter might accumulate a lifetime's worth of fine tools, and this child was buried with what might represent the combined offerings of an entire community. This child was mourned. The red ochre, a mineral pigment with deep symbolic significance in human cultures across the world, used in burial contexts from Africa to Australia to the Arctic, tells us that this was not merely a practical disposal of the dead, but a ritual act charged with meaning, with emotion, with the full weight of a human community's grief and love for a child who had died too young. The Clovis people had ceremonies. They had cosmologies, beliefs about death and what lay beyond it, about the relationship between the living and the dead, about the significance of color and material and gesture in the transition from one state of being to another. They were not simply hunters and gatherers moving through a landscape, responding mechanically to ecological stimuli. They were full human beings, as emotionally complex and spiritually engaged as any people who have ever lived. The stone tools buried with the Anzic child came from sources hundreds of kilometers away: Knife River flint from North Dakota, obsidian from sources in Wyoming and Montana, other exotic materials whose origins testify to a Clovis world of wide-ranging movement and connection. The Clovis people were not confined to a single territory, not bounded by invisible lines that separated one band's hunting grounds from another's. They moved across the continent with a freedom and a range that speaks to a world in which the normal constraints of territorial exclusivity had not yet developed. A world still so empty, still so rich, that there was no need to defend a particular piece of it against your neighbors. They followed the mammoths wherever the mammoths went, and the mammoths went everywhere. In 2014, the complete ancient genome of the Anzic child was sequenced by a team led by Morten Rasmussen at the University of Copenhagen, the first complete genome of an ancient American. What the genome revealed confirmed and extended what the archaeology had suggested. This child was ancestral to all subsequent Native American populations south of the Arctic, the genetic grandfather of every civilization the Americas would ever produce. The Maya who built Chichen Itza, the Inca who constructed Machu Picchu, the Iroquois who developed the great law of peace that partly inspired the United States Constitution, all of them traced their genetic ancestry in an unbroken line back to this infant buried in a hillside in Montana with 100 ochre-coated tools and the grief of his entire community.
The Clovis culture, for all its brevity, the Clovis tradition appears to have lasted less than 1,000 years before being replaced by the diverse regional cultures of the Archaic period, was one of the most consequential in human history. It represented the final phase of the Beringian migration, the moment at which the founding population's long journey from northeastern Siberia reached its culmination in the interior of 2 continents. And in the Anzic child, with his ochre-coated grave goods and his genetic link to every indigenous person who would ever live in the Americas, it left behind the most intimate and most moving monument to that journey that archaeology has yet discovered.
Chapter 7. The Great Extinction, when the hunters changed the world.
They arrived in a world of giants. North America, at 15,000 years ago, hosted one of the most spectacular megafaunal communities in the history of life on Earth. A community so rich and so strange that modern visitors to its fossil sites struggle to believe that these animals actually existed, that they were not the products of some ancient mythology, but real creatures of flesh and blood and bone that walked the same ground where wheat fields and suburbs now stand. In addition to the great herbivores, mammoths, mastodons, ground sloths, camels, horses, glyptodonts, the continent's predator guild was equally extraordinary, a collection of carnivores that makes the modern African lion look almost modest by comparison. The short-faced bear, Arctodus simus, was the largest terrestrial mammalian predator of the Pleistocene, a long-limbed cursorial bear whose proportions were quite unlike those of modern bears, standing 1.8 meters at the shoulder when on all fours, and perhaps 3 meters when upright, capable of running at speeds approaching 40 kilometers per hour on legs that were longer and straighter than any modern bear's. Its skull was short and broad, with massive jaw muscles designed to generate enormous crushing force. The bite of Arctodus could crack the femur of a mammoth. Modern bears are primarily omnivores, opportunists who eat berries and tubers and small prey as readily as large game. Arctodus, by contrast, appears to have been a true hypercarnivore, dependent on large animal prey for most of its caloric intake. When a band of Clovis hunters camped by a river in Montana, Arctodus was what walked into camp in the night. The American lion, Panthera atrox, was 25% larger than the modern African lion, larger than any living big cat, a predator of such size and power that it could take down prey that no modern lion would attempt. Like the African lion, Panthera atrox likely hunted in social groups, coordinating attacks on the great megafauna of the North American plains in the way that modern lions coordinate attacks on buffalo and zebra. The saber-toothed cat, Smilodon fatalis, with its enormous upper canines, sometimes 28 centimeters in length, serrated like steak knives, ambushed prey from the forest margins, driving its teeth into the throat or belly of its victim with a downward stabbing motion that severed blood vessels and collapsed the windpipe. The dire wolf, Anoscion dirus, ran in packs of perhaps a dozen or more, following the great herds and culling the weak and injured with the tireless efficiency that pack predators have perfected over millions of years of evolution. These were the apex predators of a world that had never encountered the human hunter. They had co-evolved with their prey over millions of years, developing the behaviors, the strategies, and the anatomical specializations that made them the most effective killers their respective ecological niches had ever seen. And then the Clovis people walked in. With their fluted stone points and their throwing spears and their cooperative hunting strategies and their absolute indifference to the established order of predator and prey on a continent that had never seen anything quite like them.
The megafauna of North America had survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and every natural catastrophe that the planet had thrown at them for millions of years. They had never encountered Homo sapiens. They were not ready. The Clovis hunters who walked into this world of monsters were not fearless. Fear is a survival mechanism, and the people who had survived the Arctic for thousands of years had a highly calibrated sense of when to be afraid. But they had something that the megafauna's predators did not: the capacity for coordinated group action at a scale no other predator could match, and projectile weapons that extended their lethal reach far beyond the range of any tooth or claw. A Clovis point launched from an atlatl could penetrate the hide of a mammoth at a range of 30 meters. A short-faced bear could not fight back against an enemy it could not reach.
What happened next is one of the most contested questions in all of paleontology, a debate that has generated more heat and more passionate argument than almost any other in the natural sciences, and that touches on questions that go far beyond the technical details of radiocarbon dating and fossil assemblages. Over a period of roughly 2,000 years following the confirmed arrival of humans, approximately 38 genera of large mammals went extinct in North America, something like 70% of all megafauna. Horses, which had evolved in North America and spread from there to the rest of the world, disappeared from the continent entirely. Camels, equally native to the New World, vanished. Mammoths and mastodons, ground sloths and glyptodonts, short-faced bears and American lions and dire wolves and saber-toothed cats, all gone in what geologists call the terminal Pleistocene extinction event. The Americas of 10,000 years ago were a shadow of the Americas of 15,000 years ago, stripped of most of their largest and most spectacular animals in what was, in geological terms, the blink of an eye. The debate over the cause of this extinction has been running for more than half a century with no sign of resolution. On one side stands the climate change hypothesis. The end of the Ice Age dramatically altered habitats for many of these species, transforming the productive mammoth steppe grasslands into the boreal forests and tundra of the modern Arctic, and the great interior grasslands of North America into a patchwork of woodland and scrub that could not support the megafaunal communities of the Pleistocene. Proponents of this view point to the fact that similarly dramatic climate changes had occurred at the ends of previous glaciations without triggering comparable extinctions, evidence, they argue, that climate alone was sufficient to drive the megafauna to extinction without any help from human hunters. On the other side stands the overkill hypothesis, championed most forcefully by the ecologist Paul Martin, who argued that the coincidence in timing between human arrival and megafaunal extinction was too precise to be accidental. Martin's blitzkrieg model proposed that Clovis hunters, spreading across a continent stocked with naive prey, killed at rates that far exceeded the megafauna's capacity for reproduction, not because they were wasteful or malicious, but simply because the prey had no evolved response to human predation and could not compensate for the additional mortality that human hunters imposed. In Martin's model, the extinction was swift, total, and essentially inevitable. Once humans arrived in sufficient numbers and with sufficient technology, the outcome was determined. The current scientific consensus leans toward a synergistic explanation. Climate change stressed megafaunal populations already thinned and fragmented by habitat loss, while human hunters delivered the killing blow to populations that could no longer absorb the additional mortality.
This synthesis is supported by computer modeling studies that show neither climate change alone nor human hunting alone was sufficient to drive the extinction, but that the combination of the two, operating simultaneously on vulnerable populations, could produce exactly the pattern of extinctions observed in the fossil record. The debate is not over. New evidence continues to emerge, including contentious claims of a cosmic impact event around 12,900 years ago that some researchers believe delivered the final blow to the already stressed megafauna. But the broad outlines of the story are becoming clearer.
The concept of prey naivety captures something essential about this extinction, something that no amount of climate modeling or population dynamics can fully convey. The megafauna of North and South America had evolved in the complete absence of human hunters. Unlike the megafauna of Africa, which had co-evolved with hominins for millions of years and had therefore developed the behavioral responses to human threat that we observe today, wariness at human presence, flight distances of hundreds of meters, the tendency to avoid open ground, the alarm behaviors that cascade through a herd when danger is detected. The animals of the Americas had no such evolutionary preparation. A mammoth that had survived 10,000 years of Pleistocene cold, that had endured the attacks of short-faced bears and American lions, had no context for understanding the two-legged creatures that appeared on the horizon with their throwing spears and their coordinated encirclements. Early accounts of encounters between indigenous peoples and previously uncontacted wildlife in the Americas, the Galapagos Islands, New Zealand, Hawaii, and other places where animals had never encountered human predators consistently report the same phenomenon. Animals that allow humans to approach within arm's reach, that continue feeding while companions are killed nearby, that return to a location where they have just been attacked. The boobies of the Galapagos, the moas of New Zealand, the dodos of Mauritius, all of these species were rendered extinct within centuries of first human contact, not because humans were unusually destructive, but because the animals had no evolved response to human predation. The megafauna of the Americas were in the same position, at vastly larger scale, continent after continent of large animals that did not run, that did not flee, that offered themselves to the first hunters who appeared. The loss of the megafauna was not merely an ecological event, profound as that ecological transformation was. It was a cultural event, a forcing function that compelled the descendants of the first Americans to reinvent themselves completely. Societies that had been built around the hunting of mammoth and mastodon, societies whose technology, social organization, ceremonial life, and cosmological understanding were all shaped by the demands and rhythms of megafaunal hunting, had to abandon that foundation and build something new. The tools changed. The great Clovis points, designed to penetrate the thick hides of mammoths, gave way to smaller, more versatile projectile technologies suited to deer and elk and bison. The social organization changed. The large cooperative hunting parties required to take down a mammoth were no longer necessary when the prey was deer-sized. The seasonal movements changed. Without the great megafaunal herds as the primary food source, people had to develop new relationships with the landscape, new patterns of movement, new knowledge of plant foods and aquatic resources, and the smaller animals that had survived the extinction. It was out of this reinvention, this forced diversification following the megafaunal collapse, that the extraordinary cultural diversity of the Americas emerged over the following millennia. The salmon cultures of the Pacific Northwest developed their magnificent maritime traditions in landscapes where the great coastal megafauna were gone, but the rivers ran silver with fish.
The corn-farming civilizations of Mesoamerica transformed wild teosinte into one of the world's most productive crops, feeding populations that no hunting economy could have sustained. The mound-building societies of the Mississippi Valley created monumental earthworks that rivaled the pyramids of Egypt. The forest peoples of the Amazon developed one of the most sophisticated agroforestry systems in human history. Every one of these cultures was a solution to the specific ecological puzzle that the megafaunal extinction had posed, and every one of them was the achievement of human beings as intelligent, as creative, and as fully human as any who have ever lived.
Chapter 8: The Drowned Homeland, Legacy of the Ice Age Migration.
The land bridge that made it all possible is gone. As the climate warmed and the ice sheets melted with gathering speed, the seas rose, steadily, inexorably, flooding the lowlands of Beringia from the edges inward. The process was not dramatic by human standards. Sea level rise during the deglaciation averaged perhaps 10 to 20 millimeters per year, punctuated by episodes of more rapid rise when particularly large ice sheets collapsed into the ocean. In a single human lifetime, the change would have been barely perceptible. A beach that had moved a few meters, a coastal plain that had narrowed by a kilometer or two, but across generations, across centuries, the transformation was total and irreversible. The great rivers of the subcontinent were among the first casualties. The Anadyr River in Siberia, the Yukon River in Alaska, the unnamed rivers of the Beringian lowlands between them, all of them had flowed eastward and northward across the exposed plain during the height of the glaciation, draining a landscape the size of Western Europe into the Arctic Ocean. As the seas rose, their mouths were drowned, their lower courses transformed into estuaries and then into arms of the sea. The coastal plains that had supported the megafauna, the great productive grasslands of the Beringian lowlands, where woolly mammoths had grazed for thousands of years, were swallowed by the rising Pacific and Arctic oceans. By approximately 11,000 years ago, the Bering Strait had reopened, severing the land connection between Asia and North America for the duration of the current interglacial period. The people who had crossed became permanently isolated. The submergence of Beringia was not merely the loss of a land bridge, it was the drowning of a homeland. For the Beringian people who had lived on this subcontinent for thousands of years during the standstill, the land that was disappearing beneath the sea was not an abstract geography, but a landscape of intimate familiarity. The hills where certain stones for tool-making could be found, the river bends where the fish ran thickest in summer, the coastal headlands where sea mammals hauled out in predictable patterns, the sheltered valleys where willow and birch grew thick enough to provide fuel through the killing winters. As the seas rose, these places vanished one by one, the lowest plains first, then the river valleys, finally the higher ground. The people who had made this landscape their home for generations found themselves watching their world disappear beneath the water, and there was nothing they could do but move. For the descendants of the coastal migrants who had already moved south along the Pacific coast, the rising seas cut off the path back to the north. The Kelp Highway that had carried their ancestors south was being steadily narrowed by the rising ocean. The coastal shelf that had provided the shallow, productive waters for the kelp forests was being drowned, compressing the habitable coastal zone against the cliffs and mountains of the continental margin. The world behind them was closing. The world ahead of them, two vast, resource-rich continents, was open.
And in the genetic isolation that followed the opening of the Bering Strait, the founding populations of the Americas began the long, divergent journey that would eventually produce the hundreds of distinct languages and thousands of distinct cultural traditions that made the Americas, by the time of European contact, the most culturally diverse region on Earth.
The scale of what those people accomplished in the 15,000 years following their arrival in the Americas is almost beyond comprehension. A story so vast, so complex, and so rich with human achievement that no single narrative can do justice to it. Within approximately 1,500 years of reaching Alaska, humans had reached the southern tip of South America, the fastest continental colonization in the history of our species, a southward movement that covered 15,000 kilometers in roughly 1,200 years. Within 3,000 years, every major habitat in both continents was occupied. Arctic tundra and tropical rainforest, temperate grassland and high-altitude Andean valley, Pacific coast and Atlantic seaboard, desert and river delta. Each of these environments demanded and received its own solution, its own set of technologies, ecological strategies, social structures, and cultural traditions. The agricultural revolutions of the Americas stand as perhaps the greatest intellectual achievement of the first Americans. In Mesoamerica, the ancestors of the Aztecs and Maya transformed wild teosinte, a grass with small scattered seeds, into maize, the most productive cereal crop in the world, through a process of selective breeding that required thousands of years of patient observation and deliberate cultivation. In the Andes, the ancestors of the Inca domesticated the potato, which would eventually become the most important food crop in Europe, along with quinoa, the tomato, the sweet potato, and dozens of other species. In eastern North America, a separate agricultural revolution produced a different suite of crops, sunflower, squash, goosefoot, sumpweed, that sustained the mound-building civilizations of the Mississippi Valley. These were not accidents. They were the products of sustained, sophisticated scientific thinking applied to the problems of food production by people who understood plants and soils and climate with a depth of knowledge that Western science has only recently begun to appreciate. The civilizations that eventually arose from this agricultural foundation were, by any objective measure, among the greatest achievements of the human species. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, built on an island in a lake in the high central plateau of Mexico, had a population of perhaps 500,000 people at its height, larger than any contemporary European city, served by an aqueduct system that delivered fresh spring water from the mainland, sustained by a system of artificial garden islands called chinampas that produced 3 or 4 crops per year from the shallow lake margins. The Inca road network stretched 40,000 kilometers through some of the most extreme terrain on Earth, across the Altiplano at 4,000 meters elevation, through the tropical forests of the eastern Andes, along the arid Pacific coast, connecting a population of perhaps 12 million people into a single administrative system of remarkable efficiency. Mississippian Cahokia, at its peak around 1100 AD, housed a population larger than contemporary London, with monumental earthworks aligned to astronomical events and trade connections extending across the entire eastern half of North America. All of this, every pyramid, every road, every language, every ceremony, traces back through an unbroken chain of human lives to the small bands of Ice Age hunters who followed the mammoths east. These were not isolated achievements, but parts of an interconnected web of civilizations, trading partners, rivals, occasional conquerors of one another, sharing crops and technologies and ideas across the vast distances of 2 continents through networks that operated for thousands of years before European contact.
By the time European ships reached the Americas in 1492, the two continents were home to between 50 and 100 million people, speaking hundreds of languages, practicing thousands of distinct cultural traditions, organized into societies ranging from small nomadic bands to imperial states administering millions of subjects across territories that dwarfed contemporary European kingdoms. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, with its 500,000 inhabitants, its floating gardens and aqueducts and great stepped pyramids, was larger than any contemporary European city. The Inca road network stretched 40,000 kilometers through some of the most extreme terrain on Earth, connecting an empire that ran the length of a continent. Mississippian cities like Cahokia, at its peak around 1100 AD, housed populations larger than London at the same date, with monumental earthworks aligned to solstices and equinoxes that speak to a sophisticated astronomical knowledge encoded in architecture. All of this, every city, every language, every ceremony, every artwork, every agricultural innovation, every road and aqueduct and pyramid traced back through an unbroken chain of human beings to the small bands of Ice Age hunters who followed the mammoths east across a frozen subcontinent and never went back. The shallow, cold waters of the Bering Strait today are only 85 kilometers wide and 50 meters deep at their narrowest point, a reminder of how thin the membrane was between the Old World and the New, how brief the window of the land bridge in geological terms. A single century of sea level change is all that separates a world in which two hemispheres are connected from a world in which they are sundered. The modern strait, dark and cold and swept by Arctic currents, is navigated by the Yupik and the Chukchi in their skin boats, as it has been for thousands of years, maintaining in a diminished form the connection that once existed between two worlds. On clear days, the Diomede Islands, Big Diomede on the Russian side, Little Diomede on the American side, separated by only 4 kilometers of water, but by an international dateline and 2 centuries of political history, are visible from both shores simultaneously. Beneath the Chukchi Sea to the north and the Bering Sea to the south lie the drowned remnants of Beringia's lowlands, buried river channels that once carried meltwater from Siberian glaciers to the Arctic Ocean, submerged lake beds where waterfowl once gathered in their millions, the dissolved bones of mammoths and steppe bison and woolly rhinoceroses that walked a landscape now hidden beneath fathoms of cold Pacific water. Marine archaeologists working in shallow coastal waters have begun to map these submerged landscapes, and what they are finding confirms what the geological models predicted: a world of extraordinary richness and complexity, a world that supported human life for thousands of years and then disappeared beneath the rising sea, taking most of its secrets with it. Somewhere down there, beneath the cold water and the silt of 11,000 years, lie the hearths of the Beringian Standstill, the campsites where the ancestors of all Native Americans spent their long vigil, waiting without knowing they were waiting, becoming themselves without knowing what they would become. That sunken world is the true cradle of American civilization, the lost homeland of a hemisphere's worth of humanity. And the people who came from it, who crossed a continent, killed its giants, peopled its every corner, and built from nothing the most diverse and extraordinary human world that has ever existed on this planet, are the ultimate proof of what our species is capable of when it is free to move, to explore, to adapt, and to build. The crossing of Beringia is not just the beginning of American history. It is one of the greatest stories in the history of life on Earth.